My name is Fariba Zorenabaf. I am the chair of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies program on this campus. We're very new. You may not have heard of us. I'm also an associate professor of history at UCR. Now, my own work is on pluralism, on cosmopolitan societies, on urban history. I have published on the history of Istanbul in the 18th century. I'm slowly moving into the 19th century. And I teach regularly courses on modern Iran, but I haven't taught one on the modern Middle East. And the reason I haven't done it is precisely because of the self-censorship and silencing that we are all under pressure to practice. And even though UCR is, in terms of its student body, is far more progressive, and I'm really happy to be here compared to where I was before. But these pressures are on us, and these emails that we receive from the UC president's office and region's office just keep reminding us that we have to kind of continue practicing that. And as someone who was born and raised in Iran, and under the Shah, and whose family has been subjected to this kind of silencing, it's really disappointing that we have to kind of go through this in this country. So that kind of reminds us all that democracy is a work in progress, and it should never be taken for granted. So having said that, I'd like to introduce our next keynote speaker, Professor Stephen Zunes, who is coming from San Francisco State University.
University of San Francisco.
Oh, University of San Francisco. We always make this mistake, I'm sorry. He is the coordinator of Middle Eastern Studies program there. He also teaches politics and international relations. He's a senior policy analyst for the foreign policy in the Focus Project. He's an associate editor of Peace Review and the co-chair of the Academic Advisory Committee for the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict. He has published extensively on US policy in the Middle East and Africa. I'm just going to go through one or two of his publications that focus on the Middle East. His book called Tinderbox, US Middle East Policy and the Roots of Terrorism. He has also co-edited with two other authors another book called Nonviolent Social Movements, A Geographical Perspective, which was published in 1999. And he also comments and writes on current US policy. If you go to his website, you will see his recent articles. I think the last one was September 15 that I saw, which is very interesting. So I encourage you to look at his publications on his website. I'm going to turn the microphone to him. The title of his talk today is Suppressing Discourse on Israel, Palestine, the Attack on Human Rights and International Law.
Thank you, and thanks again for the organizers and everyone who made this conference possible. It's been pretty impressive so far. I mean, I think of the other academic conferences I go to, I'm usually kind of halfway listening, thumbing through the program, checking Facebook or whatever. But I've actually been, listening, taking notes. It's been really, I mean, it's been great. And again, thank you very much. Dave and everybody, Lubna and everybody for making this possible. I just want to start off, with an observation, that for decades now, the so-called international consensus on what a realistic Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a realistic Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement would look like would be has been like a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, withdrawal from the illegal Jewish settlements, the occupied territories, special status for shared Jerusalem, Israel within its 1967, pre-67 borders with perhaps some minor and reciprocal adjustments for the Palestinian side, strict security guarantees for Israel, and a just resolution to the refugee problem. Now, as we all know, there are increasing numbers of observers who argue that due to Israel's settlement drive, the rightward drift in Israeli politics, the failure of the United States to be an honest broker, it may be too late for a two-state solution. And there's certainly those who would oppose such a settlement, even if it is still feasible, due to an opposition to Zionism that and in a manner that precludes the support of a Jewish state of Israel. And of course, whatever position that one may take on ideological or pragmatic grounds, the right to express one's views and have one's academic freedom protected is, I think we all agree, is absolutely critical. But what's striking for me, and what I want to address today, is the frequency with which those who still support a viable two-state solution, as I outline, a position that's been broadly accepted in much of the world for the past 40 years now, are frequently subjected to the same kinds of attacks, harassment, and denial of academic freedom as those who take a more hardline anti-Israel position. That otherwise rational college administrators are willing to accept this idea that raising concerns regarding a recognized foreign belligerent occupation and well-documented war crimes somehow constitutes such an extreme position that those who put forward such concerns have to be banned or be required to be balanced by someone who supports such policies. It shows just, I think, how serious the problem we're addressing these days actually is. Similarly, campaigns on campuses for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions that only target the occupation and not Israel itself have been subjected to efforts by administrators and politicians to suppress their activities. And I can't help but notice, for example, that David Horowitz's list of the dozen most dangerous Middle East studies professors in the country, of which I am honored to be one of, the majority of the people on that list were supporters of a two-state solution. And so what I want to address is that this campaign of harassment and repression we're talking about is not ultimately about suppressing criticism of Israel, but suppressing criticisms of human rights and international law. Now, it's a fundamental principle of academic freedom that academic programming is the purview of faculty and sheltered to the fullest extent from interference of any kind from administrators. Requiring balance for any university event, academic, public, or otherwise, is both utterly impractical and a clear violation of the principles of academic freedom. Allowing outside groups to influence university programming is a particularly chilling development because it means those groups with the biggest funding and loudest and most combative voices will be the ones to ensure their usually extreme views are the ones that always get represented. What we have witnessed repeatedly on campuses across the country is the propensity for college and universities administrations, even in situations where events have been scheduled where speakers are moderate supporters of a viable two-state solution and who do not identify as anti-Israel or anti-Zionist, to demand that they be balanced by far right-wing supporters of Israeli militarism and occupation. Notably, while administrators demand the inclusion of defenders of Israeli attacks on civilians and opponents of Palestinian statehood, they do not demand the inclusion of those who defend Palestinian attacks on Israeli civilians or oppose Israeli statehood. In short, supporters of a two-state solution based upon well-established principles of international law are depicted as anti-Israel, requiring they be balanced with pro-Israel speakers, even though such a peace settlement, if enacted, would leave an independent Palestinian state with only 22% of historic Palestine. For example, at a recent conference at Hofstra University, it was a peace studies conference, by the way, the provost ordered the two faculty organizers that a plenary panel on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process include a far right-wing neoconservative ideologue to balance the two other panelists, who were presenting papers which simply argued that the United States had not been an honest broker in the peace process and that more attention should be given to international law and human rights to make possible a peace settlement based upon a viable Palestinian state alongside a secure Israel. The organizers were forced to waive the deadline required for all other presenters at the conference, cut the time allotted for the original panel members, place the right-wing speaker at the end of the panel, and give her extra time in order to attack the original panelists. Similarly, at UCSC, a provost demanded that a memorial ceremony honoring a late pacifist Santa Cruz mayor and UCSC alum who, among a number of pro-peace causes in which he has been involved, had opposed the Israeli occupation, be balanced by a university-sponsored talk by a far-right-wing Islamophobic ideologue. Public backlash forced her to withdraw the proposal, but she later insisted he be included in a lecture series dominated by left-leaning and moderate scholars over the objections of the Israeli-American instructor who'd organized it. Even a former president of the United States is not immune from such treatment. Brandeis University refused to allow Jimmy Carter to speak unless his talk was immediately followed by right-wing Harvard Law professor Alan Dershowitz. Carter, you may know, has repeatedly made clear his unequivocal and unconditional support for Israel's right to exist in peace and security as a homeland for the Jewish people. However, his opposition to the ongoing Israeli occupation and colonization of the West Bank resulted in this unprecedented condition. Indeed, never before in U.S. history has a university demanded that an address by a former president of the United States be immediately followed by a strident rebuttal of his remarks. Another Nobel Peace Prize laureate, South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu, had his invitation to speak at the University of St. Thomas rescinded due to his opposition to the Israeli occupation. Despite his support of a two-state solution and his outspoken opposition to terrorism, he was considered too extreme in his views to be allowed to give a lecture on campus. The director of the Peace Studies program, Professor Chris Toffolo, lost her job for having invited Tutu and objecting to the cancellation of his appearance. Eventually, student and faculty protests forced the president to allow Tutu to speak, but Professor Toffolo was never reinstated and now teaches at a small college in Illinois. In short, it is not simply pro-Palestinian advocates who are targeted in this political environment, but anyone who opposes Israel's current right-wing government and its occupation policies, including liberal Zionists. Each and every one of the speakers I just mentioned supported Israel's right to exist, were advocates of a two-state solution, and categorically opposed terrorism. Yet, to these college administrators, opposing the occupation meant opposing the world's only Jewish state and therefore marked you as an anti-Israel extremist and possibly anti-Semitic. Opposing the policies of a right-wing government is depicted as opposing the nation-state itself, and the dangerous implications of such assumptions should be obvious. We see this in the BDS campaign as well. The international campaign calls for the right of return and comprehensive sanctions against Israel, including an academic boycott and cultural boycott, though most campaigns on college and university campuses have focused on a relatively small number of mostly US-based companies directly supporting the occupation. Even when the demands of BDS activists are limited, however, efforts to suppress their movement are severe. For example, after the student government at Loyola University in Chicago voted unanimously to recommend divestment of endowment stock holdings in Caterpillar, United Technologies, Raytheon, and Valero, the president insisted opposing multinational corporations supporting the Israeli occupation was, quote, extremely unfair to our Jewish faculty, staff, and students, and reiterated claims by right-wing supporters of the Netanyahu government that the resolution was anti-Semitic. The student government president noted the extreme pressure he and others had received from administrators to oppose the initiative, stating, quote, the only messages I received in opposition to the resolution were from concerned administrators, not from students themselves. He further noted that the resolution was in no way anti-Semitic. To critique a university's private investment is not the same as endorsing religious persecution. However, the student senate, fearing reprisals, decided not to take up the issue. Now, there are similar stories from other colleges and universities. In the vast majority of these cases, again, There is nothing in these resolutions calling for an academic or cultural boycott of Israel, a divesting from Israeli companies, or companies investing in Israel. They only focus on companies directly supporting the occupation. More disturbingly is that state legislatures and political leaders of both parties are making similar assertions. For example, in April, the Student Senate at Earlham College, a Quaker liberal arts institution in Indiana, approved a resolution by consensus recommending the college endowment divest from 3 U.S. companies, Motorola, Hewlett-Packard, and Caterpillar, which are directly supporting the Israeli occupation in violation of international law. In response, the Indiana state legislature passed a bipartisan resolution condemning the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign as anti-Jewish, accusing it of, quote, promoting a climate of hatred, intimidation, intolerance, and violence against Jews. Now, despite the absurdity of the notion that the consensus of an elected body of students at a college rooted in a Christian pacifist tradition would promote violence against Jews or anybody else, the resolution received near unanimous support from both Republicans and Democrats. A similar resolution passed in the Tennessee legislature as well, also with virtually unanimous support. Now, the tactic of boycotts, divestment, and sanctions has been used for years to press U.S. companies to stop illegally profiting from foreign occupations, particularly in cases where the United States has blocked the United Nations from enforcing its resolutions calling for the withdrawal of occupation forces in accordance with the UN Charter. Boycott and divestment campaigns in previous decades targeted companies supporting South Africa's occupation of Namibia and Indonesia's occupation of East Timor. A campaign is currently underway, particularly strong in Europe, in support of BDS against the Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara. None of these campaigns had or have much support from elected officials. But in the case of the Israeli occupation, supporters of the Israeli occupation, the right-wing Israeli government, have mounted a strong counterattack. For example, Hillary Clinton, front-runner for the 2016 Democratic presidential nomination, has declared that the BDS movement was, quote, working to malign and undermine Israel and the Jewish people. Similarly, as we know, the Democratic-controlled state assembly here in California passed a non-binding resolution 3 years ago declaring BDS advocacy anti-Semitic activities which should not be tolerated on state university campuses. For decades, student activism in solidarity with oppressed people of the global South has attracted a variety of supporters, ranging from Christian pacifists to proponents of armed revolution, and from liberal Democrats to Marxist-Leninists. The BDS movement is similarly diverse. Yet both parties seem intent on depicting thousands of sincere and principled young supporters of human rights and international law as the movement's most extreme marginal elements. But it's important that even those, again, I want to emphasize again that even those who do not believe that Israel should exist as a Jewish state, even those who support a more comprehensive BDS strategy, even those who do not distinguish between Israel and the occupied territories, should have their academic freedom protected. My point here is that these attacks are focused on even the most moderate voices, even those who take the positions of left-leaning Zionists. So the campaign suppressing dissent on campuses is not really about defending Israel or defending a country's right to exist. It's about defending a right-wing government and its supposed right of conquest. It's about defending an illegal military occupation and colonization drive enforced through widespread and systematic violations of international humanitarian law. It's about depicting what were once considered mainstream liberal values, codified in the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as somehow being radical and extreme and unacceptable discourse. There's a growing acceptance by university administrators and by politicians of both parties of the neoconservative view that the enforcement of international humanitarian law, such as provisions that bar companies from supporting illegal occupations, should be opposed, at least when it involves the United States and its allies, and that those who support the universal applications of such principles should be attacked, marginalized, and punished, such as by labeling proponents as anti-Semitic. It's also important, I think, to note that there have certainly been attempts to suppress discussions regarding war crimes and occupations of countries besides Israel. In 1998, my institution, the University of San Francisco, lost $500,000 in donations when it refused to cancel a conference on the Indonesian occupation of East Timor, featuring José Ramos Horta, who had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize that previous December. Pressures at Berkeley prevented Southeast Asia Studies or other academic departments from sponsoring his proposed Cal lecture following his USF appearance. The only venue the recently awarded Nobel laureate could get was at International House, a student co-op. Georgetown and other universities also denied him a forum. Similar pressures have come regarding the appearances of Aminatou Haidar and other Western Sahara speakers regarding the Moroccan occupation of their country. Just a few days ago, a Georgetown University scholar had her research scheduled to be published in a U.S. Institute of Peace brief on the Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara, had it rejected after it had been approved and the galleys were set and ready due to pressure from supporters of the Moroccan occupation. So on one level, Palestine is not unique. Supporters of foreign right-wing governments will go to great lengths to avoid challenging occupation and repression, will often find allies among politicians and university administrators. And it is in the interest of supporters of U.S. Hegemonic reach in world affairs to limit discourse on human rights and international law. On the other hand, there is no question that the frequency and success rate of efforts to suppress anti-occupation voices is far greater when it comes to Palestine. Why is this the case? Well, it's certainly clear that there are well-organized, influential, well-funded, right-wing Zionist groups that are capable of creating a climate of intimidation on college and universities administrations. But I would argue it's a lot more than that. In the dozens of cases I have looked at in which moderate anti-occupation speakers have been banned or required rebuttal, I have been struck that the majority of the administrators responsible for that decision have not been right-wingers, and incidentally have not been Jewish. Indeed, many have been quite liberal. Yet they have never, nor would they likely make similar demands of speakers opposed to violation of international legal norms by other U.S. allies. The reason it appears from some of these interviews I've had is that they've made an exception because Israel is the world's only Jewish state, and that anti-Semitism is a centuries-old scourge. And the fact that the frequent false McCarthyistic charges of anti-Semitism against opponents of Israeli government policies notwithstanding, there really are some people who attack Israel not out of support for universal standards of human rights and international law, but because it is Jewish. If there's only one black state in the world, you can imagine that a lot of African Americans and white liberals would be a bit defensive to criticisms of its government's policies, even if justified, out of concern over racism. Even in my case, I have been an outspoken opponent of the Israeli occupation my entire adult life. But even me, if I walk into a room, there are two people I don't know, and they're talking and they're going on and on and on about all the terrible things Israel's doing, even if I agree with everything they're saying, there's a part of me that thinks, okay, why are they saying this really? I mean, are they people who would be concerned about this no matter who is doing it? Or is there some anti-Semitism involved? And when I've challenged administrators following incidents like this, I've been struck by two things. One is their acknowledgement of their tendency, on which most of us on the liberal left end of the political spectrum can identify with. When there is an accusation of bias based upon someone's race, gender, sexual orientation, or other background, we tend to give the benefit of the doubt to those making the charges. Think about it. When we hear a charge of sexism, racism, homophobia, or other prejudice from a member of a target group, and denial of such charges by the alleged perpetrator from the non-target group, and we don't know the actual detail, who do we assume is correct? I know I tend to assume there's probably at least some basis to the charge, unless or until I have reason to believe otherwise. And usually I'm right about that assumption. In other words, supporters of Israel's right-wing government have been masterful at manipulating liberal guilt. This is dangerous on many levels, including a risk of the crying wolf phenomenon, making it more difficult to recognize and challenge anti-Semitism when and where it really does raise its ugly head. And I think this is why we must acknowledge that anti-Semitism exists, that, like racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression, it is ubiquitous and often manifests itself in unaware ways. And it must be confronted and challenged, both for our own credibility and because it's simply the right thing to do. But this brings us to another factor to take into account. Would administrators and trustees cave into such pressures if the victims of Israeli policies were white and Christian, as opposed to Arabs and predominantly Muslims? I don't think so. Indeed, it would be naive to fail to recognize that the successes of right-wing Zionist pressure groups are at least in part because their positions parallel deep-seated anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia, which makes people support occupation, repression, and colonization of Arabs and Muslims. Again, every example I've given in this talk so far has been in regard to demands by groups and by and talks by speakers who make a distinction between Israel within its recognized border and the occupied territories. And again, we're talking about leaving Israel with 78% of historic Palestine. But would another? Why would this pressure also work? Would the right-wing Zionists be so effective at intimidating college administrators and others, were it not for the fact that Israel is a U.S. ally? Opponents of Iraq's bloody 6-month occupation of Kuwait back in the early 90s, or of Russia's current occupation of Crimea, have not faced such opposition, since the occupiers were not strategic allies of the United States. Yet those of us who have opposed the Israeli occupation, and to a lesser extent the Moroccan and Indonesian occupations, are subjected to such treatment. But by silencing and suppressing those of us who oppose the Israeli occupation, even if it's, even those of us who take this position, regardless of a country's ethnic religious identity or its relationship with the United States, by successfully suppressing this kind of discourse, it makes it easier for the United States and its allies to engage in similar practices. Remember, the same rationales used for Israeli militarism and violations of international humanitarian law have also been used to defend militarism and violations of international humanitarian law by the United States. Indeed, in the past 25 years, more Arab civilians have been killed and tortured and displaced as a result of U.S. policies than Israeli policies. Similarly, unlike calls for economic sanctions against the Iraqi and Russian occupations, calls for sanctions against companies supporting the Israeli occupation are largely U.S.-based. I would argue that the willingness to defame those of us advocating socially responsible investment policies also are at least in part motivated by the belief that defending corporate profits for companies like Motorola, Hewlett-Packard, and Caterpillar is a higher priority than defending human rights. Now, these divestment resolutions are on the public record, So surely college administrators and legislators know there is nothing in the divestment resolution which are anti-Semitic or attacks on the Jewish people or promoting violence against Jews. Their opposition is based, at least in part, I believe, for the same reasons college administrators and legislators opposed divestment in South Africa: the protection of corporate profits. Back then, in the South Africa divestment campaign, the administrators could try to claim, that these corporate, these foreign direct investment in South Africa, supposedly helps the black majority. That line was easily refuted. This time, however, they can use the claim of anti-Semitism, and they have right-wing Zionist groups who can push that claim. They can use the Jews as an excuse. So activists can blame Zionist groups instead of the incestuous relationship that university administrators have, instead of the incestuous relationship that university administrators and politicians have with powerful corporate interests. Indeed, it may be only a matter of time before groups like Students for a Free Tibet, which calls for boycotts and related activities targeting the Beijing government and U.S. companies that support the occupation of Tibet, will be labeled as anti-Chinese racist. One can imagine other scenarios in which those who advocate divestment and similar actions against carbon polluters, arms manufacturers, and others will also be targeted by politicians. What I'm saying here is, if this battle in support of academic freedom was simply about Palestine and simply about the Israel lobby, it would be important enough. But it's about a lot more. It's about the freedom for faculty and students to challenge multinational corporations, to engage in socially responsible behavior. It's about the freedom of faculty and students to advocate enforcement of universal principles of human rights and international law, even when the violator is considered to be a strategic ally of the United States. Finally, one thing I've noticed in the cases I've investigated is the irony that after administrators have been confronted and presented with the facts and are forced to acknowledge that opponents of the Israeli occupation should not have been subjected to such unfair treatment, is that they themselves often fall into anti-Semitic scapegoating, claiming it wasn't really their fault since they were victims of pressure from the Jewish community. Putting aside the fact that these right-wing groups that apply such pressure are not representative of most Jews on these issues, such rationalizations bear a disturbing parallel to the centuries-old anti-Semitic ploy by those in positions of power to claim that their unpopular policies are not really of their doing, but are the result of a powerful cabal of Jews behind the scenes that are forcing them to do so. How many times have we heard this kind of thing? Remember that administrators have tried to stifle progressive student and faculty voices speaking out for peace and human rights for decades. Politicians of both parties have fought out demands for corporate accountability in the global South and human rights provisions for military aid for decades. This time, however, who gets the blame? Who is it then that has issues about Jews? Those of us who believe that Israel, no more or less than any other country, is obliged to abide by certain well-established international legal norms regardless of its strategic relationship with the United States? Or is it those administrators who try to blame the Jews for their cowardly failure to uphold basic principles of academic freedom? Is it those of us who support corporate responsibility in opposing profiting from an illegal and oppressive occupation? Or those who defend illegitimate corporate profits in the name of the Jews? Now, I am not naive about the influence of some right-wing Zionist interests have on some of our campuses. But let's not be naive about the far more powerful forces, multinational corporations, the military-industrial complex, culturally entrenched racism, the national security elites and their penchant for empire, which ultimately make possible the repression of academic freedom on Israel-Palestine. Recognizing and naming these insidious forces will challenge the polarization that makes some falsely see the conflict as one between us and the Jewish community. So let's not succumb to scapegoating the Jews or even the Zionists. Let's be frank about who really has power in this country, who sits on the board of trustees, who holds office in Congress, who is on the board of directors of powerful corporations. The percentage who are Jewish are in the single digits. These attacks on academic freedom are a form of McCarthyism. And just as very few of the targets of McCarthyism were actually communist, most of the targets of this new wave are not anti-Israel, much less anti-Semitic. In both cases, it's about stifling dissent, enforcing conformity, dividing and ruling in order to maintain the capitalist imperialist order. Regardless of whether you support one state or two states, regardless of whether you are Zionist, anti-Zionist, or post-Zionist, let's not allow the powers that be to make this a battle between supporters of Palestinian rights and Jews. Let's recognize how anti-Arab racism, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism is used to divide us. Let's recognize the efforts to stifle our voices on Palestine as part of a larger effort to stifle our voices challenging militarism, racism, imperialism, and economic injustice. And let's hold the actual decision makers, who are overwhelmingly non-Jewish, accountable for their decisions and fight back. Thank you.
We are going to take about 10 to 15 minutes for questions.
I agree with you about the big corporates running the country and all of that. But for myself, my own experience, I have been trained as a historian of Latin America. I was always an activist on Latin America. In 1980s, when the war in Central America was going on, I used to bring in really big name speakers from Sandinistas, from the FMLN and everything. I was never attacked even once on my campus on that. But the minute that I started working on Palestine, I was attacked from every side. Not only the administration, but also the rest of the faculty. Could you explain the difference, if there's any difference here?
Yeah, well, I was very involved in Central America solidarity work, and we indeed did get some attacks called we were called communist, and there were all sorts of crazy stuff. But I certainly agree that it is qualitatively worse, dealing with Israel and Palestine. And I think it's for the reasons that I outlined. I mean, if someone you say, oh, there are a bunch of there are a bunch of communists there, people would kind of come on, this is silly McCarthyistic but when people yell anti-Semitism, a lot of liberals get kind of nervous. Oh, maybe there's something to this, and they're more likely to take it seriously, and so therefore magnitudes. It's and also what makes this difficult is that in addition, I think, to the powers that be that they outlined, the real powers that be on that support the status quo in terms of U.S. foreign policy and its allies and human rights, international law, etc. There is something of a grassroots, well-funded grassroots shock force, if you will, that can move, push the agenda and make it seem like it's more of a popular opposition than it may actually be. I mean, I don't want to extend this analogy too much, but I mean, if you recall, that if you look back to medieval Europe, that the ruling class would often use Jews to be the moneylenders or tax collectors or whatever, do the dirty work for the ruling class. And so people would blame the Jews instead of people who ultimately had the power. And in certain ways, these right-wing Zionist groups are able to get away with certain kinds of attacks that would be harder to get away with if they were coming from other sources. But then the administrations and others can say, oh, we're just responding to this and act accordingly.
I have a question that is, at first, perhaps if you could just clarify your argument, and then I'm going to ask a question. So the way I understand your argument is that there are different forces that are said to shape university policies when it comes to academic freedom, and that you actually think that one of these forces is the most effective, and that is the capitalist forces,
Mhm.
forces of particular economic and financial alliances, and yet you think this is the most effective,
Yeah.
and everything else is in fact either subordinate or not really as effective as we think it is,
Mhm.
and it's those sort of
Yeah.
hidden hands.
Yeah, I wouldn't say.
It's
Yeah.
just to
Clarify. Yeah,
clear
yeah.
our argument.
I wouldn't say it's subordinate. It's not like these politicians or administrators go to certain Jewish leaders and say, "Hey, can you
Yeah.
make a lot of noise and cause a lot of trouble
So
in
that
this
we
issue?"
can do
Yeah.
that.
No, it's certainly nothing like that. I mean, and the right-wing Zionists are motivated by their own ideological agenda, independent of those that really the ultimate power holders. However, because their agenda parallels in important ways the agenda of the power holders, their influence is magnified. Their concerns are taken more seriously than they would if there was an organized group opposing or defending human rights abuses by a government the U.S. doesn't like, or anyway, just an example. Yeah.
So if this is the case, then there is an intersection
Mhm.
of different forces and different interests
Yes.
that play together
Mhm.
to produce certain disciplining and policing of
Yeah.
academic freedom on U.S.
Yeah,
campuses.
exactly.
And if this is the case, then the question of Zionism enters
Mhm.
again, because if it is one of the forces
Mhm.
that is active parallel to other economic interest,
Mhm.
then how is it that we can, if we want to identify the powers that are acting upon us,
Mhm.
how is it that we can just set it aside
Yeah.
and focus only on violations of international law
Mhm.
led by corporate interests?
Sure.
I'm just wondering if your view of power
Mm.
is not centralized, if you do appreciate the multiplicity of forces acting, whether it's administrative encroachment or whether it's financial and economic interest,
Mhm.
and whether it's Zionist
Mhm.
group,
Yeah.
then why is it that one group gets prioritized over another and we get to set aside
Mhm.
the question of Zionism?
Again, I'm saying is that these right-wing Zionist organizations have an agenda that parallels the larger interest and therefore multiplies their influence. Now, I would certainly, I think critiques of Zionism and the whole colonial settler mentality and that kind of thing is good and important. But that and obviously the freedom to be able to do so needs to be rigorously defended. But if you notice, every example I gave here, every position I took about ending the Israeli occupation, violations of international law, settlements, divesting from companies supporting the occupation, every one of these things I just mentioned could also be taken by some people who consider themselves Zionist. That's why I think it's about more than Zionism, because it's it's fine to be anti-Zionist, but what I'm saying is that there's diversity within the Zionist movement, and that the fact that they are targeting even left Zionists and people who who take the moderate two-state solution, I think demonstrates that it's about something a lot more.
I had very much the similar response to Samara about your definition of Zionism, or what I would actually put it. And at this point, it's becoming a comment rather than the question I initially had, because that's the question I initially had.
Yeah,
Are you? So let me ask you this as a question. Are you not letting Zionism off the hook by saying that it is not Zionism, it's the parallel interests or an intersection of interests, rather than Zionism is structural violence, and structural violence necessitates an incestuous relationship, to use your terms, with corporate America. Therefore, we cannot let Zionism off the hook.
Yeah, there's no question. You cannot have when you look at the origins of Zionism in late 19th century Europe and the whole colonial enterprise and the forces are there. Hey, no, I can't disagree with that. But but again, I think we should recognize that that there is diversity within Zionism, and the attacks have been against, again, even people who in theory would support a Zionist state of Israel within its internationally recognized borders. And that again, my important point is that. So again, please don't think I am in any way downplaying, the issues, the forces we've been talking about these past couple of days. I guess just wanted to please put it into the broader context of what makes it amplified, whose interest it ultimately serves, and to not lose sight of that bigger picture. That's all I'm trying to say here.
I cannot help but think that we really have to examine the history of Zionism as a movement, as a nationalist movement, as a springboard from European colonialism, and how it changed as the history of that colonialism was challenged in the 20th century. The South African struggle against apartheid, which I spent 20, 30 years involved in it, we had to deal with a strong political religious minority, the Afrikaners, who had a similar nationalism. It wasn't as, we might say it was more developed because it was 300 years old, They came to a land which was uninhabited. Some of the major myths.
Sure.
But if you strip it naked, it was a settler colonial aspect of a people, a section of a people. I mean, some people make the mistake of confusing Zionism with Jews and Jews with Zionism. But we have to understand that there is beginning, especially now, a challenge among the Jewish people in the United States and perhaps elsewhere to push back against that Zionist ideology. But I think my point is this. We are at a time now when the state of Israel and the fact that the pushback, the challenge to efforts like the divestment movement is so widespread, especially in the American universities. I was involved when I was at Stanford. We had people to speak on this question, and we had our signs up, and the next day all of our signs would be pulled down. So we knew that there was an organized challenge, and I would hazard to guess that this was state-sponsored by Israel, and it's very well integrated civilian elements in the United States, civilian sector, university sector. But I think we can't be naive that this is a very, very encompassing political struggle. It's a network. It's integrated with U.S. imperialism. Of course, Israel is a junior partner, but it's very influential. We have some of the biggest Jewish billionaires directly financing who our next presidents might be. I mean, you cannot say this is a historical magnitude of difference in the influence of this movement within the Jewish population.
And we also have even more non-Jewish billionaires deciding who are the presidents.
The fact is, we have to see this as an integrated nexus. It's not just the Zionists, it's the Zionists in league and integral league with U.S. imperialism and other allies.
Yeah, that's what I was arguing. Yeah, that's what I was arguing.
Split hairs.
Yeah.
Now, my last point is this. In terms of your isolation, and it is a sort of ideological isolation being in the ivory tower, so to speak, because most of your struggle, most of your connections are in academia. But the struggle in order to outwit or outmaneuver the people that are opposed to freedom of speech, and freedom of speech is a dagger in the heart of this the Zionist struggle, no doubt about it. It's a heart. Freedom of speech is a dagger thrust at the heart of imperialism, especially nowadays because of the wider net of opposition to this, especially in the United States now that the Palestinian struggle is amassing a much more informed historical relationship with the African American community, with the Latino community, and these are the future majorities of the United States body politic. So we can pretty well predict that the politics at the present, the reactionary politics of the Republican Party and its allies, won't be the politics of 20 years hence.
Right.
And that means everything, including the present forward position of U.S. imperialism, is going to be challenged and quite radically changed. So I think that, do you think that, is there something that you can do in terms of broadening your struggle from academia by reaching out to the larger sector of progressive, especially the youth opinion in the United States, in this multi-ethnic characteristic?
It strikes me that there's a weakness, or at least something that's been left out so far, and that is in terms of phrasing it with regard to the West Bank, the Palestinians who are on the wrong side, if you will, of the wall, that really ignores what's going on inside Israel proper with regard to the 20% of the population that are Palestinian inside Israel. And so there is a challenge which I think we have to acknowledge, that we're not simply talking about a two-state solution. We're talking about what happens inside the state of Israel. That's also got to be a part, because part of the oppression, part of the colonialism, if you will, is occurring internal to Israel. We can argue it also involves some of the Ethiopian Jews and some of the others, but in particular with the Palestinians. And I think in that sense, there is that some of the defenders of Israel are very nervous and reacting, because even if you postulate a two-state solution, that doesn't end the discussion about how they are structuring inside. So this whole concept of a Jewish state versus a democratic state within Israel really has to be brought into the discussion as well.
I always used to wonder why it was that Britain stayed in Northern Ireland, since there didn't seem to be actually much material or other benefit for them in doing so. And in some ways that question arises around Israel. So I'm curious what you think more specifically than just some parallel interests that support each other Israel's value to the United States is. And my own sense is that Israel has formed, as Northern Ireland did during the Troubles, a really crucial laboratory for emerging forms of state. British sociologists have argued that Northern Ireland was like a laboratory for what they call the strong state in Britain. I would call it the neoliberal state in its emergence. And firstly, and this is the first part of my question, what role do you think Israel's high-tech military research plays in that, the ways in which the Palestinians are used as guinea pigs in this whole range of technologies of oppression, control, population movement, incarceration, and so forth. The second thing is perhaps more a comment than a question, but I'm trying to understand the status of the term. I'm trying to understand the status of the term left Zionist and what you're saying. I mean, I have no tolerance, to echo Jeff's paper earlier, for the idea that somehow Israel's liberal and utopian soul has been damaged by the perpetration of an occupation and the militarization.
There are problems in the beginning, no question.
But it seems to me that there is just Zionism, and that left Zionism is a kind of oxymoron, because when it comes down to it, in order to have Zionism at all, you have to have racism, you have to have the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, you have to have a Jewish state for a Jewish people, which cannot take place on land occupied by Palestinians for centuries, without all those components. So I sort of begin to feel like I'm in some kind of fantasy land when the very term liberal or left...
That's quite reasonable. The reason I use left liberal Zionist is that's a label that some people describe themselves, and that people who describe themselves can be our allies in terms of defending academic freedom. People who label themselves that way can be and have been targeted as much as those of us who take a more radical critique of Zionism. So I was using that as an example. Similarly, I'm not implying that there aren't issues with Israel itself. I'm not saying that the occupation is the only issue. Again, I'm using this. I just use this as an example to show that even those who do focus solely on the occupation are subjected to the same kinds of things. So I'm not taking an ideological position on any of these things. I just use these examples just to show that the struggle, that the forces that are targeting us are not just those who are concerned about the continued existence of the state of Israel as a Jewish state. It's those people who raise any concerns about human rights, international law, these kinds of fundamental questions. In terms of expanding the movement beyond academia, I obviously addressed academia because this is the subject of the conference, but I've certainly been active in grassroots movements myself, and have actually been quite excited at the way that especially young people have been getting involved in the cause. Indeed, with the exception of LGBTQ issues, there is no issue, according to public opinion polls, where age parallels attitude more exactly than Israel-Palestine. The younger you are, the more likely you'll be sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. It's quite striking. We're already seeing, at least in some levels, the manifestations of this policy. But also to get back to your first question, which I think is a really important one, about why the U.S. Supports Israel. Again, it's beyond just the lobby, to be sure. I mean, after all, as I mentioned, as East Timor and Western Sahara has shown, we certainly don't need a influential minority group to get the U.S. to support the invasion, occupation, suppression, and colonization of an ally by a weaker neighbor. But I think there's a lot of things. There is the military-industrial complexes. Indeed, are very tightly intertwined in these kind of counterinsurgency tactics. Israel's actually, in addition to U.S. Training U.S. Israeli forces. Israeli have trained U.S. forces who are going to Iraq in terms of in counterinsurgency, counterterrorism activities. In terms of new jet fighters, anti-missile defense systems, even Star Wars technology. Very, very close relationship between the Israeli and American military-industrial complex. The CIA and Mossad cooperate in intelligence gathering, covert operations. Israel has funneled U.S. arms to third parties we couldn't give to directly for political reasons, like the Contras, Guatemalan junta, apartheid South Africa, Iran. More recently, the Colombian paramilitaries. There's a whole number of whole number of ways they back U.S. interests in the Middle East and beyond. We also have the ideological thing. I mentioned kind of the old romantic liberal thing about Israel and kind of seeing it as a global affirmative action or whatever. And of course, and then there's the Christian right and this common millennialist ideology, which sees modern Israel as a precursor of the second coming of Christ. I mean, there are these 40 million fundamentalist Christians who identify with that. Many times the Jewish population, and they've essentially taken over the Republican Party, for all intents and purposes. And so there are a whole number of factors that have made this this kind of alliance between the United States and Israel, and the kind of alliance that they don't like people like us challenging, even the so-called moderates who still believe in a two-state solution.
Thanks. Just two quick things. First, in terms of liberal Zionism, when the ASA passed its boycott, a handful of self-identified liberal Zionists within the association wrote very critical op-eds of the ASA, all in the name of academic freedom, saying the boycott was violating academic freedom. The rest of us were shocked but not surprised that this turned out to be the first and last time we ever heard from those figures as defenders of academic freedom, even given all of the subsequent outrages. So absolute silence when it came to Stephen Saleta and any number of other kinds of cases around academic freedom. The second thing I was going to say, I just wanted to quickly suggest a formulation that might be helpful in terms of thinking about the relationship between Zionism and capitalism. I was reminded of the 90s culture wars and the ways in which people who were arguing against certain kinds of ethnic studies research as identity politics would often say the really important thing is class, not race. And the rejoinder I remember being persuasive to me from Stuart Hall was the difficulty there is that many people experience their class identity via their racial identity. And so in this particular case, I might suggest that many elites in the United States experience their commitment to capitalism via their commitment to Israel.
Thank you for your talk. I wanted to push the point about occupation again because it was where we started yesterday. And I'm going to make a statement, and I'd like to hear what you think about it. In the 1890s, when the first wave of immigration comes to Palestine, the multiple kinds of Zionism that are on the ground then, cultural, territorial, practical, political, there are a whole diversity of different iterations of Zionism. They all have the same problem. How do we create a state that is both Jewish and democratic on a piece of land where the majority of the people are not Jewish? That problem then continues to be the problem today. Why are we still talking about 1967 versus 1948? What is that? What does that distinction mean for you? And then the second question, and if this is too personal, you know, please feel free not to answer it. But you also suggested at some point that you yourself feel uneasy. You expressed anxiety and unease, and I would just, because you've shared that biography, I would just like to hear more. Where does that come from? Is it because Israel is representative? Is it because maybe unpacking that part of it would help us get to the question?
Sure.
I actually have just a very quick comment, more or less for the record, more than for anything else, which is that references to the Israeli-American military-industrial complex and the way in which, you know, what America sees in Israel as a so-called ally have always, and as a kind of laboratory for high-tech military whatever, have always struck me as really kind of strange in the sense that, as far as I can tell, by any kind of objective measure, Israel is militarily an utter and total laughingstock and failure in the sense that it's tried to control the people for 60 years and has absolutely abysmally failed at the task. Even in places that are much more small scale, like Gaza or Lebanon, for instance. I mean, immediate conflicts that are much smaller than, let's say, the 60-year conflict over Palestine. Israel's military record is it's like a laughingstock, really. It's abysmal in its inability to translate its technical capacity for blowing things up and killing people into anything in terms of political accomplishment. So I just never understood what it is that anybody sees in this army and in this state that's meant to signal, you know, because it's often used as Israel, you know, they know how to do this and they can, you know. But I mean, in fact, they can't actually, and they've failed again and again and again and again at doing anything real in terms of actually controlling people. So I just, it's not addressed to you necessarily, Stephen. It's just I don't understand where the thought comes from. This is a very powerful.
That's an excellent point, and that's why I think we're starting to see many people within the U.S. military establishment starting to raise those very questions. I mean, even people like David Petraeus and others who are looking at the cost-benefit analysis and saying, "Hey, this doesn't really add up." And I'd certainly agree with that. Even if I was looking in narrow terms of U.S. national interest, I would have problems with the U.S.-Israeli relationship. But unfortunately, as we all know, that everything from Vietnam to Iraq, and there are a lot of supposed strategic analysts in high positions who can't see that, who really think that having all these arms, having all these weapons can mean that you can dominate. But everything from guerrilla warfare, to nonviolent civil resistance, it's becoming clearer and clearer that the power of the state, particularly enforced through military means, is getting weaker and weaker. I don't think Israel is an exception in this at all. We have far more powerful militarily. We couldn't subdue Iraq. We couldn't subdue Vietnam. We couldn't. I mean, there's So again, I agree with you, but the perception, unfortunately, I think is very different. In terms of the question about the contradiction from Zionism, yes, it was like that way from the beginning. Though I should mention there were some Zionists like Martin Buber and others who did not want a Jewish state per se, but and the cultural Zionists, did not agree with that, but. So if those are the only kind of Zionists around, I could see how Zionism might work. But unfortunately, they're a minority even then, and even a smaller minority now. Why do I make a distinction between the occupied territories and Israel proper? Is simply, I think, in terms that there's a distinction made in international law. There is a distinction, made through the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, and And as a result, I think that it is even the ability to target Israeli activities and challenge Israeli activities in the what are recognized as territories under foreign belligerent occupation, which includes East Jerusalem, are a lot stronger. And efforts to oppose those of us who are simply saying we should, our government, our companies, our universities should not be supporting that. Seems particularly reasonable. That you see, we're not. I don't think we're going to be able to convince a majority of Americans to accept a radical post-colonial critique of Zionism. But we can, I think, convince people that we shouldn't be supporting a brutal, repressive occupation that is violating international legal norms. In fact, I think in certain ways the BDS movement would be strengthened if, in addition to Palestine, they included the one other recognized foreign belligerent occupation and against the wishes of the subjugated population, and that is Western Sahara. There are a similar number of companies that are supporting it, and in that way, people would stop that line. Why are you singling out Israel? Saying, "Oh, we're against all occupations," and Morocco is an Arab Muslim country. But these are so I'm mentioning it's more on strategic and tactical levels. Again, I'm not. I think we do need to ask the bigger questions regarding Israel, even within its internationally recognized borders. And in terms of the unease, I think it's simply because that, as I mentioned, anti-Semitism is ubiquitous, it's insidious, like other forms of prejudice, and that there are people, and any of us who've been involved in these in pro-Palestinian solidarity work, we've come across these people who are motivated by certain prejudices involving Jews that I don't think should have anything to do with our movement, and that it's and again they're a small minority, but they are there, and so I think the unease comes from if I have a colleague who's going on about something about an African American colleague of ours that they don't like. Again, if I agree with the things they're complaining about, again, I have to sort of think. You have to think about that. You have to, and similarly with sexism, homophobia, it's something one needs to be sensitive and aware of. And the problem with a lot of liberals is that they get paralyzed by it. Someone mentioned anti-Semitism. And don't question if there's any justification behind the accusation. And so I think we just recognize that is there. And so again, that's why I think that when we do see genuine manifestations of anti-Semitism within the ranks of pro-Palestinian solidarity work, we really do need to challenge it, both, again, because it's the right thing to do, because we should challenge any kinds of isms, any kind of prejudice, bigotry, wherever we find it. But also, I think it's really important for our credibility, to be able to speak out and challenge it and name it when we see it. If anybody wants to, I have a website, stephenzunes.org. You can see my writings on this thing. I have an email list where I send out emails of my policy briefs and articles, mostly in U.S. U.S. Middle East policy, but various other topics as well. More Israel-Palestine than any other, but I do cover a range. And if you would like to be on my email list, I'll leave a sheet of paper that you can sign, or you can leave your card. Either way. But thanks again.